I thought I would start with a very short story. Mel Bartley, when she was an undergraduate, was told by an elderly family friend that when he was her age, he met an old man whose grandfather had been Napoleon Bonaparte's drummer boy at the Battle of Waterloo. And I don't know whether the story is true. And I've done the maths, I've done the timeline, and it just about works. And I've always loved that story because to me, a lot of life course research is actually also about history. And for me, it's quite remarkable that there could be a sort of living link with the Battle of Waterloo. And I was reminded of that story when I was preparing this talk, because as you'll see, part of the development work I did on the life course was done when I was working as a general practitioner up in Edmonton in the 1980s. And Edmonton at that time was a normal London area of London with terrace streets and occasional semi-detached houses or detached houses. But it would much like anywhere else in London. But when I was working as a general practitioner one day a week, and in the morning I would do a surgery, and in the afternoon I would go and talk to an elderly patient about their memories. And through their memories I came to see Edmonton as how it had been when they were children before the First World War. It was an area of country estates, interspersed with market gardens to feed London, and brick fields to make the bricks that built London, and stables to keep overnight all the workhorses that kept London moving. And the largest occupational category in Edmonton at that time was ostler, which most people don't know what it is. It's someone who looks after horses. There were so many horses in Edmonton. And the other thing, I looked up the old records of the medical officer of health of Edmonton from this period. And he used to have to deal with outbreaks of smallpox, which, so this way in which you can, the life course research and looking back over people's life course can link you into history is one of the things I find fascinating about life course research. And I think an underdeveloped aspect of it in a way that people, they talk about inter-cohort comparisons without actually any real feel for the lived experience of people and how it differed between cohorts. So I thought that got me in the mood for this talk. And I called it a life grid because I knew there were about event history calendars, but the life grid, I think, is a special type of event history calendar because it looks at the whole of people's lives. Most life history calendars are for much shorter periods. Sometimes in occupational sociology, there'll be 10, 20 years. Sometimes in the study of income dynamics, it's just a couple of years. But to go back 60 years is quite unusual. And as you'll see, one of the reasons I did this work quite a while ago and then somewhat forgot about it and did other things. But became interested in it again when it met the needs of the new USA National Institute of Aging international portfolio of aging studies, because they all started their sample of people age 50 and looked forward. But then the life course perspective came along and people started saying, well, what happened before age 50 would also be important. And so all of these studies started to collect retrospective data. And I'll talk about it in a bit, but it was a version of this life grid. The context in which I became interested in it and did this work was the Boyd-Orr cohort, which was a cohort of children from the 1930s who John Boyd-Orr studied in terms of nutrition and health. And with some colleagues in Glasgow and Bristol, we recontacted these people 60 years later in the 1990s. So we had measured data from the 1930s when they were children and the 1990s when they were in their early old age. And what was required was a sort of method of collecting data from the 60-year period in between. And of course, at the time, there was this, largely because of the development of the birth cohort studies and the demonstration of prospective data avoided a lot of the problems of retrospective data, like telescoping and so on. But rather than get involved in a slanging match of prospective versus retrospective, what we set out to do is ask the question, well, which type of retrospective data can be recalled with useful accuracy, and how much difference does it make depending on the way you collect these data? So that was what I set out to do. Well, the issue was in the air at the moment. One of the books that had a big influence on me was Louis Moss and Harvey Goldstein's The Recall Method in Social Surveys, which is a lovely book, and everybody who's interested in data collection should read it, from 1979. And a few years later, the British Sociological Association had an annual conference on history and sociology, which was put this area on the map. And at the same time, an ESRC program called SCELI, Social Change in Economic Life, started using event history calendars on a large number of people around the country. So the issue of retrospective data was in the air. The first thing we had to do in a way was establish what the difference between what we were trying to do and what were at the time the experts in long-term memory. And one discipline that had long studied long-term memory was psychology. And psychology at the time argued that emotionally powerful information is remembered best long-term. But for psychology, long-term meant a few weeks or months, rarely 60 years. And what the early accounts from the mass observation diaries showed was that it was precisely the things that had an emotional charge that were called most inaccurately long-term. And the way we made sense of this was that emotionally charged issues are things that people keep returning to in their lives and tell themselves stories about and redefine them. So almost they've lost. They themselves are not sure which is the real accurate version, what they remember and are saying or what actually happened. And a nice example of this was in one of the mass observation studies, an account of a person being caught above ground in an air raid during the Second World War, where in his diary he recorded how terrified he had been. And he compared that himself with a piece he'd forgotten about his diary, and he'd written a piece 30 or 40 years later saying, "Oh, we were used to it. We could take it." Another example we found with the Boyd-Orr cohort was that we had these records of the food the children had eaten were eating in the 1930s. And if talk about a carbohydrate-rich diet, it was tapioca, semolina, rice pudding, bread and margarine, jam, but not what we never found one person who would say that they had a poor diet when they were children. And the way we made sense of this was that people remember their mothers doing their best in very difficult circumstances. And to admit that their diet was not good would be an insult to the memory of their mother. So we think that, unlike psychology, that emotionally charged issues are poorly recalled, either because the endless retelling of stories or because of the moral load. Another example from the mass observation diaries was somebody whose diary all the way through the war was full of these complaints about how difficult it was to find pipe tobacco. A continual refrain for this gentleman. And when we interviewed him 50 years later, he said he'd never been a smoker. And, it was obvious that the sort of meaning of, the moral meaning of being a tobacco smoker had changed from something which was manly and acceptable to something which implied drug addiction and moral weakness. And so we decided that what we were doing was different from psychology. And the other discipline that was looking at memory was oral history. And oral history's line at the time was that long-term memory is selective and creative, not a reliable guide to the past. And we had quite a lot of sympathy with that idea, but we think oral history ignored something which it knew, which was that often background contextual information is recalled accurately. I remember going to an oral history conference where a very distinguished oral historian was talking about farm work in the 1930s and how people who were apprenticed farm workers, if they started to fall in love with each other, where it was part of the responsibility of the apprentice family to look for this, to recognize it when it happened, and then make sure they were transferred to separate farms so that it wouldn't go any further. And the oral historian said, well, of course, that was very important. No one had ever noticed that before. But still, it was, I think oral history underplayed the extent to which the background contextual detail is recalled accurately. So, like good people, Lee Berney, who was working with me on this, did a literature review of the accuracy of long-term memory. And we looked for studies that had some sort of gold standard against which to judge memory. So for the first one, moving house, this was a Belgian study where every time you move house, you have to register with the police. So you could get an objective record of people's housing moves. And they found that if you took a single adult, they could do a pretty good job of it on their own. If you got them together, they got even better. Although there were minor errors, people said road instead of street, and number 57 instead of number 59, and so on. But by and large, people could remember their houses. Changing jobs was judged against occupational pension records. And once again, recall right across the life course was pretty good, provided minor errors were ignored. Health, judged against medical records. Everyone knows about height and weight and the extent to which it tends to recall and self-report are normatively biased. But what some of these studies showed was that the accuracy of recall fell off long term. In terms of health and disease, it was very poorly recalled. In the Boyd-Orr study, where we had a record of all the infectious diseases of the children in the 1930s, it bore, what people remembered bore almost no resemblance to what was in the record. And this, partly it was just that in those days no one ever told people what it was. You probably found the same when you were doing surgery. You would find patients and you would look at their abdomen and there would be this great surgical incision scar. And you'd say, what was that for? And the patient would look puzzled and say, well, they didn't tell me. So that maybe is part of it. Event history calendars, as I mentioned here with the Skelly, were in use, but rarely beyond 20 years, never right across the life course. So, as a result of the literature and going to conferences and listening to other disciplines, we started off with the idea that firstly you should distinguish between transitions and states. States were, say, a person stayed in the same job or the same house. Transition is when you move jobs or you move house. That you can increase the accuracy of the dating of transitions if you anchor them to the public sphere, like the start of the Second World War. Was that before or the war, or had the war started by the time you got married? Or to family events. Did your first child come before your mother died or after? And then when you want to find out about the states, the house the person lived in, the job they did, stick to the humdrum background details of life. For example, we found that one of the most accurately recalled items in a person's life was when they had their first indoor toilet. That was recalled with almost 100% accuracy. And you can imagine the difference it must have made to people that they no longer had to go outside in the middle of the night if they wanted to go to the toilet. But something they probably hadn't thought about since. So this is when I was doing in Edmonton, talking to elderly patients, interviewed in their own homes. I interviewed people on their own, but sometimes they would have a family member in the next room. And one of the things I learned was the extent to which women are the repository of family memory, because often you'd be interviewing a man and you'd ask them where they came in the birth order and what were the names of their children, and he would yell through to the kitchen, "What's the name of our second child?" So, and I developed this bag of things that, because I also wanted to take people's blood pressure and lung function, the stopwatch to see how quickly they could move and so on, because I was interested in trying to relate people's lifetime experiences to their objective measures of their health in early old age. Well, in older age by now. So I used to start with the family of origin. Well, the first line was always the external one with what you put on the external line, the public line, varies with the person's heritage. So for British people, the Second World War would be important. For people from the Indian subcontinent, partition was important. For people from the Caribbean, hurricanes, particularly destructive hurricanes, were important. But then you get onto the second timeline was the family of origin. Nearly everybody can remember whether they've had brothers and sisters and where they came in the birth order. And once you get to do that and you get people to work through all that and relate it to the external timeline, you begin to get a structure. And then did you marry, have children, when, and so on. And then you can move to the areas of interest. When I was interested in housing and work hazards. So, and then only when I'd done the exposure ones of housing conditions and working conditions did I get to the more directly health relevant ones about tobacco smoking and health. And by doing the life grid with a pencil and an eraser, you could, as people's accuracy of dating increased, you could rub out their first guesses and put in their more accurate ones. And there was a lot of that. Then, when you wanted to find out about the estates, I used show cards for each house people had lived in and each occupation. There were some people it was impossible. For example, bar staff would rarely, right across their life, have stayed in the same job for more than 3 months. And it was just impossible. I mean, a waste of time. You just had to take a representative few. People who were professional armed forces, stationed here, there, and everywhere. But for most people, what was noticeable about most people's lives was the stable shape that typically there was stability until late adolescence, where there was a period of chaos, moving jobs, moving homes. Then in early 20s would settle, and it would stay more or less the same until the death of the spouse 40 years or so later, and then there would be another period of chaos as they readjusted to a new life, and then it would be stable again. Quite often the reaction at the end of the completion of a life grid was a look of amazement and sadness. Is that all? Is that my life? Because, yeah. Then you had to do the measure height, weight, speed of movement, balance, blood pressure, lung function, and record all the prescribed medications. And then with the data analysis, you add up the hazard exposures and relate them to the health outcomes. And as a result of this pilot work, I found it really, it was doable. I found it amazing because for me it was walking history, as I mentioned earlier. Women carry family history, and it's time consuming. I also used to tape record the interviews, and what used to terrify me playing them back was the danger of bullying. You can get so carried away trying to get information out of people that sort of there were times that I'd had a cosh out, started breaking their fingers. So you have to beware getting carried away. Then ESRC funded us for a 1-year grant to compare LifeGrid interview data with records from 60 years ago from the Mass Observation Archive down at the University of Sussex, and the Boyd-Orr records. And we did this double blind. The interviewer didn't see the records before they did the interview, and the interviewee was not told the focus of the recorded period. It was presented as being interested in the whole timeline, the whole life course. And on balance, we found the life grid collected with useful accuracy retrospective information over 60 years on the humdrum background details of life. So then the SRC funded us as part of the health variation program to do this in a study of health in the Boyd-Orr cohort. And the best balance we could get between what we could afford and what was statistically doable was 300. And we had money for 2 researchers, and they did 150 of these life grid interviews, 3 a week for a year and a half. I know in one case, this almost caused divorce of one of the researchers, because he and his partner would have breakfast together on Saturday morning, and he'd say, "What did you do in the week?" And she'd tell him, and she would say, "Well, what did you do in the week?" And he said, "Another 3 bloody interviews." But it was one of the interesting things about this was that, unlike the methodological validation study, people saw the Boyd-Orr records before they did the interview, and both of them said they would press the bell and they would have no idea what the person was going to look like who opened it. That these were all people of more or less the same age. And they said that, if we'd been going on our impressions, there was a sort of, around chronological age, there was a physiological age span of about 30 years. You just couldn't tell. And you can see, it was interesting that before the Second World War, it turns out there wasn't any idea of random sampling. So Boyd-Orr aimed for a representative sample. And he set out in Aberdeen, they were farming communities. In Dundee, they were working in the jute trade. In Barrow-in-Furness, they were building ships. In South Yorkshire, they were coal miners. The Wash, they were farm labourers. Shoreditch, they were tailors. Fulham, they were more affluent as a sort of control group. And Swansea, I think, was a mixed bag. And all these, the final slide is all the reference details if anyone wants to look at any of these. What we showed was that social and health disadvantage in childhood predicted forwards to greater cumulative life course exposure to health hazards. So these lifetime exposure scores, which we calculated from the interviews, we had from the Boyd-Orr cohort what the person's health and living conditions were as children, and we could see there was an association. And that's Paula Holland's paper. We also found, looking backwards, that social disadvantage in early old age predicted backwards to greater cumulative life course exposure to health hazards. And that's Lee Berney's paper there. And Scott Montgomery was more interested in the biology and showed that there was an association between childhood growth and blood pressure in early old age. But the biological stuff was less clear-cut often. Then, as I say, we then, in the Boyd-Orr cohort, we looked at, in subsequent studies, at life course predictors of nutrition in early old age, life course predictors of quality of life in early old age. But we didn't go back to the lifegrid. That was just the data we had in the data archive. And then, as I say, the National Institute of Aging started to this international portfolio of studies of aging, all of which were cohorts, panels, starting at age 50. And they were looking for a way of collecting retrospectively what had happened between birth and 50 in this study. And there was a gentleman at the University of Nebraska called Bob Belley, who worked on the USA National Survey of Income Dynamics, which is a panel study that collects data every 2 years. And he had developed a computerized event history calendar to collect at each wave information on what had happened in the preceding 2 years. And Carly Lessoff and Kate Smith at the National Center for Social Research modified Bob Belley's computer program into a computerized lifegrid, which is now being widely used. And that's it. I think, is that about right?
That's lovely.
Yeah.